funcionamiento de las empresas pequeñas.
As we look to the future, the Executive Secretariat for Integral Development will continue to leverage cooperation and partnerships to expand our reach, proving that together we are much more than the sum of our 34 member states.
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
Nosotros estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se buscó creo con los de la OEA y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno y lo dieron todo lo que era mano de obra y el material para hacer las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo todavía.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona de adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children. And they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other that they're growing together.
Esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
More than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
SETI's results for 2018 proves our effectiveness as a development partner, placing people at the center of our work and leveraging partnerships and cooperation to transform policy imperatives into action. With an eye on the rapidly changing global context, SETI is innovating to constructively address the emerging challenges and opportunities for the region. As part of our competitiveness program, SETI is designing precise tools to assess assets and capabilities in the productive sector to determine paths towards higher value goods and services. As our flagship program for partnerships, the Americas Competitiveness Exchange on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, the OAS, will continue to leverage good practices and the power of networks to increase trade and investment in the region.
For us, the role of the OAS is very important, connecting countries, connecting governments and private sector, and letting us know what other countries are doing it and how we can replicate that in our countries to enhance development.
For me, who has come here to look at how can we develop our own ecosystem, our own innovation hubs, our own accelerators, I think seeing this, touching, feeling it, seeing the transformation, seeing how quickly you made it happen is a testament to what is possible. So I believe all of us leave here stronger than ever.
The Working Group of Experts on Subnational Competitiveness, the GTEX, is our gateway program to promote local economic competitiveness policies alongside municipal and state-level governments, together with the private sector and academia.
Este tipo de reuniones te sirven para darte cuenta de todo lo que se está viviendo en América Latina sobre los temas de competitividad. Y hoy justamente en este sector estamos viendo sobre todo los temas de innovación tecnológica, pues que si hablamos de competitividad tenemos que hablar de tecnología. Y me está ayudando mucho para ver el panorama de ver lo que están haciendo otras ciudades y lo que podemos llegar a aplicar también nosotros en México.
The hub on the transfer and commercialization of technology is strengthening national innovation ecosystems by training budding entrepreneurs to take promising products and services from idea to market.
¿Por qué es importante que estemos juntos en esto? Porque la región tiene que estar unida y me parece que hay mucho conocimiento en la región que todavía no está explotado comercialmente como podría ser, y esta es la mejor manera de hacerlo.
Tenemos la proyección de cada año generar y compartir nuevas experiencias entre aquellos que contribuyen a la innovación. Queremos cambiar el cómo lo hemos estado haciendo en Latinoamérica. Queremos generar la unión de los países, queremos colaborar.
Our virtual platform on technology foresight, Prospecta Americas, will support OAS member states in identifying and mapping future trends and technological development of critical importance for the Americas.
Este esfuerzo, el cual viene siendo apoyado por la Organización de los Estados Americanos, nos permitirá tener una gran información para poder mapear estas iniciativas de innovación y poder que ellas contribuyan al crecimiento económico, a la competitividad y al bienestar de nuestras naciones.
Como bien sabemos, nos encontramos ya en la cuarta revolución industrial, la que está cambiando rápidamente la forma en que se hace negocios, se produce, se consume y se genera bienestar y entretenimiento en el mundo. Es la mayor amenaza, tal vez la mejor oportunidad que tenemos en nuestras naciones.
The Inter-American Teacher Education Network, the I-10, is working to improve the quality of teachers with an emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. In 2019, the I-10 launched the first STEM Teacher Fellowship of the Americas. The Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas, ECPA, is working with governments in the Caribbean to advance electric mobility and clean transport as the sub-region pursues energy independence. Under our Integrated Water Resource Management Program, SETI is responding to the demand for platforms and applications that capture and disseminate real-time information. This includes the expansion of Costa Rica's Plataforma Interactiva de Aplicación del Clima Tropical to the rest of Central America to help build resilient agriculture. The Inter-American Committee on Ports is building human and institutional capacity through public-private partnerships to address port modernization, logistics, and security. CooperaNet, SETI's multi-stakeholder platform for cooperation and partnerships, is being relaunched in 2019, responding to member states' call for a more robust hub for cooperation. As more consumers begin or end their shopping process online, SETI has entered into a partnership with the private sector to digitize millions of micro, small, and medium enterprises across the region.
Las buenas noticias es que sabemos por qué están fracasando, porque no son visibles. Y el hecho de que ahora lo puedan ser, haciéndolo ellas mismas, no solamente rompemos las 3 barreras del tiempo, conocimiento y dinero, sino que les permitimos tener éxito y dejar de fracasar a los porcentajes que lo hacen ahora.
Es una herramienta que sin duda acerca a las MIPYMES hacia la demanda que hoy está migrando a Internet, y con eso pretendemos mejorar las ventas y el posicionamiento de las empresas pequeñas.
As we look to the future, the Executive Secretariat for Integral Development will continue to leverage cooperation and partnerships to expand our reach, proving that together we are much more than the sum of our 34 member states.
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
Nosotros estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se buscó creo con los de la OAS, y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno, y lo dieron todo lo que era mano de obra y el material para hacer las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo todavía.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona de adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children, and they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other, that we are growing together.
Este video fue producido con la ayuda financiera de la Unión Europea.
Hoy, esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
More than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
SETI's results for 2018 proves our effectiveness as a development partner, placing people at the center of our work and leveraging partnerships and cooperation to transform policy imperatives into action. With an eye on the rapidly changing global context, SETI is innovating to constructively address the emerging challenges and opportunities for the region. As part of our competitiveness program, SETI is designing precise tools to assess assets and capabilities in the productive sector to determine paths towards higher value goods and services. As our flagship program for partnerships, the Americas Competitiveness Exchange on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, the OAS, will continue to leverage good practices and the power of networks to increase trade and investment in the region.
For us, the role of the OAS is very important, connecting countries, connecting governments and private sector, and letting us know what other countries are doing it and how we can replicate that in our countries to enhance development.
For me, who has come here to look at how can we develop our own ecosystem, our own innovation hubs, our own accelerators, I think seeing this, touching, feeling it, seeing the transformation, seeing how quickly you've made it happen is a testament to what is possible. So I believe all of us leave here stronger than ever.
The Working Group of Experts on Subnational Competitiveness, the GTEX, is our gateway program to promote local economic competitiveness policies alongside municipal and state-level governments, together with the private sector and academia.
Este tipo de reuniones te sirven para darte cuenta de todo lo que se está viviendo en América Latina sobre los temas de competitividad. Y hoy justamente en este sector estamos viendo sobre todo los temas de innovación tecnológica, pues que si hablamos de competitividad tenemos que hablar de tecnología. Y me está ayudando mucho para ver el panorama de ver lo que están haciendo otras ciudades y lo que podemos llegar a aplicar también nosotros en México.
The hub on the transfer and commercialization of technology is strengthening national innovation ecosystems by training budding entrepreneurs to take promising products and services from idea to market.
Porque es importante que estemos juntos en esto, porque la región tiene que estar unida y me parece que hay mucho conocimiento en la región que todavía no está explotado comercialmente como podría ser, y esta es la mejor manera de hacerlo.
Tenemos la proyección de cada año generar y compartir nuevas experiencias entre aquellos que contribuyen a la innovación. Queremos cambiar el cómo lo hemos estado haciendo en Latinoamérica. Queremos generar la unión de los países, queremos colaborar.
Our virtual platform on technology foresight, Prospecta Americas, will support OAS member states in identifying and mapping future trends and technological development of critical importance for the Americas.
Este esfuerzo, el cual viene siendo apoyado por la Organización de los Estados Americanos, nos permitirá tener una gran información para poder mapear estas iniciativas de innovación y poder que ellas contribuyan al crecimiento económico, a la competitividad y al bienestar de nuestras naciones.
Como bien sabemos, nos encontramos ya en la cuarta revolución industrial, la que está cambiando rápidamente la forma en que se hace negocios, se produce, se consume y se genera bienestar y entretenimiento en el mundo. Es la mayor amenaza, tal vez la mejor oportunidad que tenemos en nuestras naciones.
The Inter-American Teacher Education Network, the I-10, is working to improve the quality of teachers with an emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. In 2019, the I-10 launched the first STEM Teacher Fellowship of the Americas. The Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas, ECPA, is working with governments in the Caribbean to advance electric mobility and clean transport as the sub-region pursues energy independence. Under our Integrated Water Resource Management Program, SETI is responding to the demand for platforms and applications that capture and disseminate real-time information. This includes the expansion of Costa Rica's Plataforma Interactiva de Aplicación del Clima Tropical to the rest of Central America to help build resilient agriculture. The Inter-American Committee on Ports is building human and institutional capacity through public-private partnerships to address port modernization, logistics, and security. CooperaNet, SETI's multi-stakeholder platform for cooperation and partnerships, is being relaunched in 2019, responding to member states' call for a more robust hub for cooperation. As more consumers begin or end their shopping process online, SETI has entered into a partnership with the private sector to digitize millions of micro, small, and medium enterprises across the region.
Las buenas noticias es que sabemos por qué están fracasando, porque no son visibles. Y el hecho de que ahora lo puedan ser, haciéndolo ellas mismas, no solamente rompemos las tres barreras del tiempo, conocimiento y dinero, sino que les permitimos tener éxito y dejar de fracasar a los porcentajes que lo hacen ahora.
Es una herramienta que sin duda acerca a las MIPYMES hacia la demanda que hoy está migrando a Internet, y con eso pretendemos mejorar las ventas y el posicionamiento de las empresas pequeñas.
As we look to the future, the Executive Secretariat for Integral Development will continue to leverage cooperation and partnerships to expand our reach, proving that together we are much more than the sum of our 34 member states.
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
Nosotros estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se buscó creo con los de la OAS y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno y lo dieron todo que era mano de obra y el material desaparecer las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo todavía.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona de adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children, and they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other that they're growing together.
Hoy, esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
More than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. as we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
SETI's results for 2018 proves our effectiveness as a development partner, placing people at the center of our work and leveraging partnerships and cooperation to transform policy imperatives into action. With an eye on the rapidly changing global context, SETI is innovating to constructively address the emerging challenges and opportunities for the region. As part of our competitiveness program, SETI is designing precise tools to assess assets and capabilities in the productive sector to determine paths towards higher value goods and services. As our flagship program for partnerships, the Americas Competitiveness Exchange on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, the OAS, will continue to leverage good practices and the power of networks to increase trade and investment in the region.
For us, the role of the OAS is very important, connecting countries, connecting governments and private sector, and letting us know what other countries are doing it and how we can replicate that in our countries to enhance development.
For me, who has come here to look at how can we develop our own ecosystem, our own innovation hubs, our own accelerators, I think seeing this, touching, feeling it, seeing the transformation, seeing how quickly you made it happen, is a testament to what is possible. So I believe all of us leave here stronger than ever.
The Working Group of Experts on Subnational Competitiveness, the GTEX, is our gateway program to promote local economic competitiveness policies alongside municipal and state-level governments, together with the private sector and academia.
Este tipo de reuniones te sirven para darte cuenta de todo lo que se está viviendo en América Latina sobre los temas de competitividad. Y hoy justamente en este sector estamos viendo sobre todo los temas de innovación tecnológica, pues que si hablamos de competitividad tenemos que hablar de tecnología. Y me está ayudando mucho para ver el panorama de ver lo que están haciendo otras ciudades y lo que podemos llegar a aplicar también nosotros en México.
The hub on the transfer and commercialization of technology is strengthening national innovation ecosystems by training budding entrepreneurs to take promising products and services from idea to market.
¿Por qué es importante que estemos juntos en esto? Porque la región tiene que estar unida y me parece que hay mucho conocimiento en la región que todavía no está explotado comercialmente como podría ser, y esta es la mejor manera de hacerlo.
Tenemos la proyección de cada año generar y compartir nuevas experiencias entre aquellos que contribuyen a la innovación. Queremos cambiar el cómo lo hemos estado haciendo en Latinoamérica. Queremos generar la unión de los países. Queremos colaborar.
Our virtual platform on technology foresight, Prospecta Americas, will support OAS member states in identifying and mapping future trends and technological development of critical importance for the Americas.
Este esfuerzo el cual viene siendo apoyado por la Organización de los Estados Americanos, nos permitirá tener una gran información para poder mapear estas iniciativas de innovación y poder que ellas contribuyan al crecimiento económico, a la competitividad y al bienestar de nuestras naciones.
Como bien sabemos, nos encontramos ya en la cuarta revolución industrial, la que está cambiando rápidamente la forma en que se hace negocios, se produce, se consume y se genera bienestar y entretenimiento en el mundo. Es la mayor amenaza, tal vez la mejor oportunidad que tenemos en nuestras naciones.
The Inter-American Teacher Education Network, the I-10, is working to improve the quality of teachers with an emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. In 2019, the I-10 launched the first STEM Teacher Fellowship of the Americas. The Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas, ECPA, is working with governments in the Caribbean to advance electric mobility and clean transport as the sub-region pursues energy independence. Under our Integrated Water Resource Management Program, SETI is responding to the demand for platforms and applications that capture and disseminate real-time information. This includes the expansion of Costa Rica's Plataforma Interactiva de Aplicación del Clima Tropical to the rest of Central America to help build resilient agriculture. The Inter-American Committee on Ports is building human and institutional capacity through public-private partnerships to address port modernization, logistics, and security. CooperaNet, SETI's multi-stakeholder platform for cooperation and partnerships, is being relaunched in 2019, responding to member states' call for a more robust hub for cooperation. As more consumers begin or end their shopping process online, SETI has entered into a partnership with the private sector to digitize millions of micro, small, and medium enterprises across the region.
Las buenas noticias es que sabemos por qué están fracasando, porque no son visibles. Y el hecho de que ahora lo puedan ser, haciéndolo ellas mismas, no solamente rompemos las tres barreras del tiempo, conocimiento y dinero, sino que les permitimos tener éxito y dejar de fracasar a los porcentajes que lo hacen ahora.
Es una herramienta que sin duda acerca a las MIPYMES hacia la demanda que hoy está migrando a Internet, y con eso pretendemos mejorar las ventas y el posicionamiento de las empresas pequeñas.
As we look to the future, the Executive Secretariat for Integral Development will continue to leverage cooperation and partnerships to expand our reach, proving that together we are much more than the sum of our 34 member states.
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
nosotros estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se buscó creo con los de la OEA y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno, y lo dieron todo lo que era mano de obra y el material para hacer las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo todavía.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona de adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children. And they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other that they're growing together.
Con la ayuda financiera de la Unión Europea.
Esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
The meeting now. On behalf of the Summit to the Americas Secretariat, I'm pleased to kick off this virtual seminar on the situation of freedom of expression in the Americas, offered jointly by the Summit to the Americas Secretariat and the Special Rapporteurship of Freedom of Expression from the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights within the framework of implementation of the Lima Commitment. My name is Maria Celina Conte. I am the interim director of the Summit Secretariat, and I warmly greet the Assistant Undersecretary of State of Public Diplomacy of the United States, Mr. John Piechowski, a country that currently presides over the Summit's Secretariat or process, and we eagerly await your remarks. A warm welcome to everyone and to all the experts, ladies and gentlemen who are with us. A warm welcome to the Special Rapporteur for the Freedom of Expression of the ISHR starting October of 2020. He was appointed by the Secretary General to head up that Special Rapporteurship. That's Pedro Vaca. Also, the director of the Freedom of Expression Center of Studies, that's Dr. Agustina del Campo from the University of Palermo, as well as independent journalists, Ms. Monica Barro, Mr. Fernando Chamorro, and Ms. Luz Meli Reyes, who will share with us their views of the situation of freedom of expression and journalism in the region. It's also, well, the fact is this is a wonderful panel. We're very lucky to have them. We appreciate greatly their participation, given their vast background in upholding, defending the freedom of expression. They will share their thoughts with us. Now, ever since the Lima Commitment was passed, democratic governability vis-a-vis corruption, in the 8th Summit of the Americas, the Summit's Secretariat, as the technical secretariat of the Summit's process, has been promoting a different fora and opportunities for an exchange of knowledge and thoughts among member states in measures taken to prevent and fight corruption. Now we're going to talk about freedom of expression in the hemisphere as a key legal good for democracy. The Special Rapporteurship for Freedom of Expression resulted from the second Americas Summit and seeks to bolster fundamental freedoms and democracy. We are a region in which journalists face a host of challenges, and that is why we create this opportunity, a very broad one that seeks to enrich this process, not just following through on the Lima summit, but also in the run-up to the next summit, and also on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the American Democratic Charter, especially Article 4. Among the key elements for the exercise of democracy, freedom of expression, and journalism, or of the press. And we're going to take a look at what has been happening in the region in this area. We seek to delve into this subject matter, to take a look at the ties between acts of violence, freedom of expression in the region, transparency, access to information as key elements in the anti-corruption agenda, as well as the fact that there's been a rise of violent language in public discourse and debate, and there is a need for us to strengthen judicial systems, judiciaries, and to look further into anything that undermines freedom of expression. And so this is an opportunity for us to establish direct dialogue with key players in the summit's process, including journalists, journalistic organizations, investigative journalists that push forward a regional agenda, also international organizations and think tanks that are interested in protecting freedom of expression. With this, I conclude, and I would give the floor now to the Secretary of Hemispheric Matters, Ambassador James Lambert, for his welcoming words. You have the floor, Ambassador.
Pues muchas gracias, Maria Celina.
Thank you very much, Maria Celina and colleagues of the Summit Secretariat and other people from the IACHR. Welcome, John Pichowski.
Almagro, and in my capacity as Secretary for Hemispheric Affairs of the Organization of American States, I'd like to welcome you all to this dialogue organized jointly between the Summit Secretariat and the Office of the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. I welcome John Pichowski's participation, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Public Diplomacy in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the Department of State, as well as the Rapporteur of Freedom of Expression, Mr. Pedro Vaca, and our experts today, as Maria Celina has suggested, de lujo, Agustina del Campo, Monica Baró, Fernando Chamorro, and Luz Meli Reyes, who will share with us their particular analysis regarding the situation applying to freedom of expression and journalism in the region. As mentioned in the event's agenda, freedom of expression is key in the advancement towards more stable and participatory democracies, since without it, it's impossible for other democratic elements to be present. And for this reason, freedom of expression has been considered a fundamental condition for the existence of democratic societies. And the relationship between the effective enforcement of freedom of expression and the preservation of democracy as a central value is important, and as such is present in the various instruments of the Inter-American system, in particular the Inter-American Democratic Charter, which was approved in 2001 as a manifesto that recognized representative democracy as the only legitimate form of government in the region. In Article 4 of the Democratic Charter, it mentions, among the fundamental components of the exercise of democracy, freedom of expression and of the press. And for its part, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has stated eloquently that freedom of expression is a cornerstone upon which the very existence of democratic society rests. It is indispensable for the formation of public opinion. It is also a sine qua non for the development of political parties, trade unions, scientific and cultural societies, and in general, those who wish to influence the public. It represents, in short, the means that enable the community, when exercising its options, to be sufficiently informed. And consequently, it can be said that a society that is not well informed is not a society that is truly free. Since the Second Summit of the Americas, the heads of state and government of the region have highlighted the role, the right of freedom of thought and expression in the consolidation of democracy, ratifying their support for the Office of the Special Rapporteur for the Freedom of Expression within the Organization of American States and committing to support its ongoing mandate. In our continent, the Inter-American instruments were designed to establish principles and safeguards for the full exercise of freedom of expression, and they do not have a simply declarative or theoretical spirit, but rather they are intended to inspire its day-to-day protection and respect in the face of the very real challenges which are encountered. And thanks to the work of the Office of the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression that has been carried out, several of the events that have threatened freedom of expression, such as physical or verbal violence, as well as acts of censorship, have been analyzed and publicly denounced. And this in turn has an important deterrent effect on authorities who might otherwise compromise these fundamental rights in their interest of political gain or corrupt intent. So particularly pertinent in these days is the initiative entrusted by the 2018 General Assembly to the Special Rapporteur in coordination with the OAS Department of Electoral Cooperation and Observation and the Department of International Law to prepare a guide that addresses the growing problem of dissemination of false information on social networks, particularly in electoral contexts. So I trust that this debate will contribute to identifying the priorities of the region's public agenda in relation to freedom of expression and strengthening of the regional democratic mechanisms, and support the summit's efforts as we move towards the 9th Summit of the Americas to be hosted in the United States of America around these very important issues. So thank you to all of the experts and panelists today for their participation.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Lambert, for your welcome. I'd like to give the floor to Mr. John Piekowski, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Diplomacy of the Bureau of the Western Hemispheric Affairs of the United States Department of State. You have the floor, Mr. Piekowski.
Buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being with us.
Before I get into my remarks, please let me express my appreciation to Ambassador Lambert for inviting me to speak with you today. I think the event, this discussion that the Summit Secretariat and the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression have organized is such a vital and critical discussion. I recognize many of the panelists, all of their names. Some of them I have interacted with. This group is really the all-stars of hemispheric journalism, true champions for transparency and freedom of expression. So thank you for being with us today. This is such an important discussion, as I said. It's fitting that we are having this conversation online, which is an arena that the right to impart, seek, and receive information is under stress, even during this pandemic. To those of you joining us from across the hemisphere who are engaged in the struggle to defend freedom of expression and to report, thank you. This is a critical task that all of our democracies need, and wherever you find yourself, you're performing an important job. For the United States, our commitment to freedom of expression means that we are a friend and champion for all of those out looking into issues of local importance as well as national importance. We believe freedom of expression exercised both online and offline is a cornerstone of democracy. A free and independent media helps ensure rule of law, provides access to necessary information, and it shines a light on activities of government and the powerful. Freedom of expression helps give us the transparency and accountability that our systems and societies need, allowing government officials and leaders throughout the society to be more responsive. Our leaders called for the establishment of the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression at the Second Summit of the Americas in Santiago de Chile in 1998. As the United States prepares to host the 9th Summit of the Americas, reaffirming the region's respect for democracy and fundamental freedoms must remain a priority. Fundamental freedoms in general and freedom of expression in particular only endure when governments commit themselves to democratic principles. This is true even in governments in which democracy is well established. It is so important right now in this moment, as we have all seen the stakes for freedom of expression rise, and the imperative for us grows more critical by the day as we confront the global pandemic of COVID-19 or climate change. We all have a part to play to enable independent media to operate freely and safely, and to protect the ability of individuals to access, share, and discuss information to protect their health. Our commitment is equally important at home. We are confronting a new and fast-paced frontier in information warfare. We must take steps to ensure that media, that journalism can play a critical role in strengthening our democracies. To that end, the Biden-Harris administration is renewing the United States' commitment to the continued credibility and independence of the Voice of America and the U.S. Agency for Global Media. We are also prioritizing transparency. The White House and the State Department have committed to holding almost daily press briefings to increase the transparency and the connectivity between the American government and to journalists from the United States and around the world. We stand with, and we advocate for all of those journalists working throughout the hemisphere. I'm going to talk about the threat that journalists face in authoritarian regimes, but let us not forget that in many places in the hemisphere, journalists, even those working in democracies where there are legal protections for freedom of speech and expression, face threats from narcotics trafficking organizations and other criminal groups, from other corrupt non-state actors and terrorists. So this is a challenge that journalists face. And in fact, the United Nations has highlighted that Latin America and the Caribbean is the deadliest region in the world for members of the press. UNESCO's Observatory of Killed Journalists database reported 22 journalists killed in Latin America and the Caribbean in 2019. And the US-based Committee to Protect Journalists has cited that since 1992, 57 journalists have been killed in Mexico, and another 14 are missing. So we need to find ways to defend the rights of journalists to practice their profession, whether the threat they face is from state censorship or if it is from non-state actors who threaten and kill journalists. Having said that, I want to focus on state censorship. Reporters with Borders has described in their 2020 index that respect for press freedom in Latin America and the Caribbean is in a state of overall decline. From physical attacks to threats perpetrated online in cyber harassment campaigns, journalists are facing an increasing array of state-backed tactics to stifle their voices. Cuba, for example, continues to harass journalists who work independently of government control. This is true whether they work online or offline in traditional media. These censorship policies would not be tolerated anywhere else in the hemisphere. from manipulating social media, government trolls, and distortion of stories. So this remains a very important front, and Cuban journalists continue to put themselves at risk covering the important stories that the Cuban people in the world need to hear. I think we've also seen in the case of Venezuela, whether the issue is the pandemic of COVID-19, the repression so many Venezuelans face, or the continuing humanitarian crisis unfolding in the country, Maduro's regime continues to imprison, harass, and otherwise interfere with journalists. This is something, again, where we see in the face of this challenge, brave men and women from Venezuela continuing to tell the story. It falls to all of us affiliated with the OAS to continue to press for transparency, for press freedom, which is such an important right. We have Mr. Chamorro talking later. And again, Nicaragua is another country where we see increasing state harassment and the enactment of laws that are increasing censorship and stifling the freedom of expression of the Nicaraguan people and independent media outlets. So as we talk about this, what can we do? Part of our role, of course, is to work together as governments, but we also have a role to engage with civil society, independent groups, both here in Latin America and the Caribbean, and throughout the world. The Inter-American Democratic Charter, which is so important to all of us, and which celebrates its 20th anniversary today, I think really stands as our North Star. And as we press for freedom of expression and the ability of journalists to practice their trade without threat, whether it's from government or from non-state actors, we should use the guiding light that the Inter-American Democratic Charter provides to all of us. So to close, I just want to say we all know the importance of journalism to protecting our democracies. The famous U.S. journalist Walter Lippmann once wrote that there can be no, quote, there can be no higher law in journalism than to tell the truth and to shame the devil, end quote. All of us here today shall advance our commitment to and continue to advocate on behalf of those who seek to inform us about society's open and hidden truths, whether those truths are corruption from government, corruption in the private sector, state repression, state inefficiency, or state ineffectiveness. On behalf of the United States government, I want to underscore that we support you and value your work. Thank you for all that you do. Muchísimas gracias. Que les vaya bien.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pikolski, for your words. Now, I'm pleased to give the floor to Pedro Vaca, the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression. He's first going to give us a presentation on the situation of freedom of expression and journalism in the region, after which he will moderate the panel. You have the floor, sir. Thank you very much. I would like to thank everyone here, Ambassador Lambert, who opened this session, John Pikowski from the U.S. State Department, and Maria Celina, the director of the America Summits process. This is a very important opportunity for the Special Rapporteurship on the Freedom of Expression of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. This is a necessary and special conversation when we look at the original mandate of the Special Rapporteurship of the Freedom of Expression in the Americas, we have to also address the summit's process as well as journalism and democracy. This strengthens our institutional commitment to the topics we are addressing today. The Summit Secretariat was quite generous in providing us with this opportunity to hold a conversation that's very timely at a crisis, a critical moment for the U.S., in which democracies themselves are under threat. Millions of people are suffering during the pandemic. And I would say, however, despite that bleak outlook, there is much promise. But that said, still, civil rights are also under threat. Now, the Lima commitment was signed on to, which brought a host of mandates to fight corruption in the region. Among these mandates, I would like to underscore one, which has to do with the freedom of expression, to protect the work of journalists, to do so in keeping with international commitments and obligations on human rights, including freedom of expression. And so that addresses some prior comments made regarding the Summit Secretariat. I'm pleased to introduce those who will be with us for the next hour and a half on our panel. I thank you for accepting the invitation by the Summit Secretariat and our Special Rapporteurship, Luis Meli Reyes. And you can join us as I introduce you. She is a Venezuelan independent journalist, director and co-founder of the digital portal Efecto Cuyo. She received an OAS scholarship. She is a professor in political communication from the Simón Bolívar University. Welcome. Also with us, Carlos Fernando Chamorro, an investigative journalist with a vast record in Nicaragua. He is the editor and the founder of Confidencial, a news website and weekly publication combining investigative journalism, analysis of current affairs. Mr. Chamorro is a winner of the 2010 Maria Moores Cabot Prize from Columbia University and Knight Fellow of Stanford University, 1998. Monica Baró, I thank you too for being here. A Cuban freelance journalist currently living in Madrid. She won the Gabo Prize in 2019 for her work, La Sangre no fue amarilla, Blood was never yellow. Born in Cuba in '88, graduated from the university in journalism in 2012 at the University of Havana. She worked for a year and a half in a state magazine called Bohemio, the oldest in the region. In 2015, she began working as a reporter and member of the editorial board of Periodismo de Barrio, an independent digital magazine, through the end of 2018. Now, from the south of our continent, I would first introduce Agustín del Campo. He is the director of the Center of Studies of Freedom of Expression and Access to Information of the Palermo University. She, rather, is a lawyer and has a master's degree in international law with a specialization in human rights from the American University Washington College of Law, a member of the group of experts on freedom of expression of Columbia University in New York, undergraduate and graduate professor on international rights and human rights and international law at the University of San Andres and in Palermo. She is an author and contributor to publications on the subject. Now, let's talk about journalism. It's the oldest, one of the oldest professions in the world. and we are very stubborn in our defense of these values. First, democracy, which cannot exist without free and open journalism, and human rights, because you can't exercise any single human right if people don't have free access to information, can express their opinions and information. There has to be public access to it, and that is what is at the heart of the daily activity carried out by journalists. Now, I would like to open this talk with a brief remark about freedom of expression in our region at this point in time.
Que el periodismo en las Américas se
believe that journalism in the Americas faces the problems as usual and new problems too. We are a region and there's violence against the press. In most cases, this is done with impunity and it is tolerated. From lethal violence going through threats and harassment. All of these have direct impact in the work, in editing rooms, and especially in the information that our citizens receive. Fear that something violent will happen because you publish information of general interest is something that should not exist, but it's still there in our region, very present there in our region. For public powers or legal powers, authoritarianism is always a seduction. And power can only be practiced democratically if this power sort of takes a certain distance from this authoritarian seduction. Of course, it's easier to govern without press and with a lot of propaganda. This is very cheap to do with public resources in digital times. But the social cost of that being a formula is something we already know. We're still suffering from it, and especially it is in total contradiction with international instruments that states of the region have undersigned and that which they have committed to comply with, from the Rapporteur's Office as well as for the United Nations. We are very concerned about the trend to establish restrictive legal frameworks to civilian freedom of expression, association, and participation. Of course, the pandemic adds an additional layer of difficulty, even though taking care of pandemic is a priority for all states and we can't be indifferent to that. If measures of exception are used to take away from public debate, plurality, and diversity, that is an issue. Journalists not only are afraid for their lives and integrity, they also have to weigh their findings with the possibility of being prosecuted and think about the standards that say that there is a common purpose, but that in practice are simply instruments of censorship. We are an opaque region, even though the agendas of transparency and access to information have made great progress, but still the culture of secret, that public box where there's relevant information, but the key of which is kept very carefully by certain powerful actors so that we don't know more than we should, is a problem too. Exile is a very sad word today as ever, and it leads us to reach the conclusion that there are personal values that have to be protected, such as life or freedom, and that are become greater than the wish to live in the country. And for journalism, this is a terribly painful crossroad, but it's also but that is also present in the region. We all want good quality press, but it would seem that the availability of resources to do that is a challenge that has to be weighed in a difficult fashion by many journalists. In many cases, official publicity operates effectively as a kind of blackmail that gives a price for silence and punishes for criticism, and in that case, the press, since it wishes to survive, ends up losing certain points because it doesn't become a point of reference for a society that is both dispersed and passionate. In some cases, when the good quality journalism gets some funding, immediately they are discredited because they stigmatize by those to whom it is more easy to denigrate press than to simply accept controversial research and investigation. Here, this problem shows the muzzle that always exists, which it simply has different accents and intensities, but it is present in a large portion of the countries in the region. Internet gets involved in this equation. It is included in this equation. It also has an impact on journalism, but in a positive way in many cases. But I want to concentrate in other cases. This technology adds at least 4 more variables to the framework of human rights. The new infrastructure, which contrary to the others, instead of becoming domestic, it became transoceanic, opening a discussion on sovereignty and jurisdiction, in which you also have to include the issue or the aspect of public responsibility and the reach of corporate power. We also have to think about the codes that give a certain order to internet, but also contribute to acceleration and speeding up of biases. Then there's the scale, because the number of tensions between liberty or freedom of expression and other rights increased exponentially. Today, in our region and in no country of the world is there one technological, social, or institutional structure that can resolve all the dilemmas and violations of human rights that we can see minute by minute. A fourth variable is profitability, because the economy of attention places the online experience of people and their expression as an asset of the publicity market, with serious dilemmas on privacy and the democratic participation. The dynamics of digital deliberation are different from the analog types, which have structured the right to freedom of expression. Censorship also is expressed in other ways, sometimes through noise, and the actors who wish to censor don't only recur to traditional ways of doing it, but they also complement those actions with deliberate actions to capture public debate. Actually, it is a paradox between freedom of expression, because it implies the identifying phenomena of silencing others, and the coordinated action of agenting so much within a conversation, often in order to manipulate, in order to gain a space in the public debate through volume, sacrificing controversy and democratic pluralism and democratic deliberation. The design of algorithms, AI, that is artificial intelligence, and gaps in protection to privacy of users have accelerated this new step of censorship, in which the censor not only muzzles expression, but also then those who contradict have 2 options. Either they remain quiet, or they have to develop their own noise. Both to denounce corruption and to contain expansion, it is essential that democracies make progress with the supply of diverse and professional journalism. Unfortunately, this challenge goes hand in hand with a critical moment for journalism, both for reasons of security and for reasons of economic sustainability, where press has to choose between survival, its extinction, or its being captured. Journalism has to work in terms of democracy and human rights, and democracy have to accompany professional journalism. To recover and expand the ability of professional or capacity of professional journalism is a central task in our times. The situation for journalism is not easy, but may be seen in terms of democracy and human rights. It shows that it's so necessary to protect journalism in the Americas. Given that, I would like to now begin our discussion. We have a number of guiding questions that we have already shared before with our panelists, and I would like to invite Luzmel to take the floor. First, with a general question regarding the future of this beautiful profession in the Americas. What does journalism face in our region? How close are we from it becoming extinct, or from surviving, or from being captured? In your opinion, Luzmeli, what is the future of press in our region? Good morning, still good morning. Thank you to the technical secretariat of the summit's process, Maria Conte and Pedro, and the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression. Greetings to Ambassador James Lambert and to Jan Pichowski, I think he is still here, and to our other colleagues. I greet you all because I'm still moved by the presentation made by Pedro. Pedro showed us this whole situation as an overall vision going through all of our situations. And I believe that all of those participating here have this overall vision, but also the more specific vision in each area. For instance, to speak about exiling of journalists in the 21st century is still something very painful, because it is one of the dangers and risks that we face, those of us who have decided to continue informing in authoritarian context, as is the case of people, some of the people who are here. We have to deal also with prisons. To think that some journalists and others are arrested simply because they're trying to practice or exert a right such as the freedom of expression or seeking information. We also pay a very cruel tax. It is paid by silence, by self-censorship, and that can lead many journalists to slowly die. I will give you 4 examples on this, and then I will make some concluding comments on this future, which I don't think is that promising, because authoritarian regimes are becoming stabilized. And some of these practices that Pedro described are becoming natural. I have 4 colleagues that I truly like. They work in the investigation portal armando.info. They had to leave Venezuela because they were denounced through libel. In any other part of the world, this kind of accusation, such as libel, is settled in a trial, in a court, and journalists have the right to defend themselves. That is not the case in Venezuela. The 4 of them had to leave the country, and when one of them, who I truly appreciate and I like because he's a young journalist, when he told me that he had to leave the country, I said to him, well, I was very sad because I knew that the next ones would be several of us who had been doing independent journalism. Today, everyone who is part of Armando.info is still in exile. They're being attacked by certain powers indirectly through other journalists, that what they do is attack cruelly, and that is by generating disinformation and by libeling and slandering and harassing. That is a pattern we have seen in Venezuela, which has been denounced. But what happens with this slander vis-a-vis the journalist? That he or she has the burden of proof. And it ends up being a lesson because many others decide then to not speak. In the case of those of us who work for Efecto Cocuyo, we have been persecuted and attacked. We had to leave. We had to eliminate the bylines of certain journalists in the portal so that they could not be harassed and attacked individually. Fe y Alegría, which is a Catholic broadcasting media, they are also being attacked through abuse of power. We've seen this not only in the large cities, but we also have to look at smaller regions who, for instance, receive these kind of radio broadcasts. There are about 5 million people in Venezuela who live in what is called an information desert. This information desert is due to the fact that about 200 media have been closed down for different reasons. since 2004. And within that context, many journalists, research and investigation journalists, we know how difficult it is to truly become a specialized investigation journalist. Well, they have had to leave the country. And to conclude giving you this context and these examples and give the floor to participants, I would like to recall that during the pandemic of COVID-19, when we truly need information, when people truly need information, well, opacity is still the way in which people go, and there's no public access for information in Venezuela. The Ministry of Health has denied a right for request for information on a vaccine plan that could be carried out in the country. That's just as a point of information. In brief, that is what we're facing lately in Venezuela, and I would like to thank you for having invited me, and I'm still, of course, at your disposal, at your service for any other questions you may have. Thank you, Luz Meli. Self-censorship is an important point in that. I would like to ask Carlos Fernando to speak. What is the future that you see in the region, the future of journalism in the region? What is the horizon, which we hope will be more promising? Thank you to the rapporteur's office. This is Carlos Chamorro. Thank you for the rapporteur's office and for allowing us to share what we are going through in Central America and Nicaragua. Future is uncertain, but press survives, and it is surviving under the worst aggressions and threats in Nicaragua. In Central America, there are obstacles to the freedom of expression promoted by governments in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, but in none of these countries is there something that can be compared in its brutality with what is seen in Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, there's no rule of law. In Nicaragua, we live under a police state, and we are in a national emergency, an emergency arising from a profound crisis of human rights, which ended by the de facto elimination of all democratic freedoms, freedom of association, freedom of expression, freedom of the press. This crisis began with the brutal repression brought about by the Ortega Murillo regime against civil unrest that arose in April 2018. There were over 320 murders. No one has been punished for them. And starting with that process of repression, the press, well, which already had been sort of a target for intimidation, repression, and persecution, it became an enemy that they tried to destroy lethally. And I could briefly describe all the various mechanisms of aggression against the press that they used. Murders such as Angel Ganoa, a journalist, which remains unpunished, Radio Darío's, broadcasting eliminations, customs blocking against newspapers, threats to journalists, which led to the exile of over 70 colleagues, among them some of the team of Confidencial, the aggression to the editing rooms of Confidencial. They stole everything in our editing rooms, and then they permanently occupied them for over 2 years. Also, criminalization of journalism. A couple of journalists ended up being for 6 months in prison and being tortured, and several colleagues were sentenced and convicted. And this has led this week with a de facto confiscation of the Confidencial and 100% Noticias editing rooms. Our editing room ended up allocated to a health service with the photos of Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo, which are symbols of dictatorship and censorship, where for over 20 years we had a press room where we spoke about journalism in freedom. Today, the crime of closing this media has been erased by installing a health service, an alleged health service. That is the fingerprint of dictatorship, which is building a monument against the freedom of expression. The same thing happened 2 days later in the news channel called 100% Noticias. However, Confidencial and 100% Noticias have never stopped informing, have never stopped reporting, investigating this crisis of human rights. Never. The Nicaraguan press is continuously being attacked, and it has to resist in Nicaragua and in exile. And I think that this would have not happened had it not been by the connection of the media with their public. What Pedro said was very true about that noise of social networks, but there's also a great potential with the involvement of citizens with their cell phones in order to inform, to report about acts of repression, about acts of rebellion, about the transformation that is happening in the country. Small media could not cover these events at a national level. The press not only has resisted and survived under very difficult economic conditions, but it has also done and made good quality journalism. This is what explains why in a country such as Nicaragua, where the regime alleges that only 172 people have died due to COVID-19, that is, according to the regime, Nicaragua is the country that is an example for the rest of the world regarding how unlethal the pandemic is. But according to press investigation by independent press, over 7,600 people have died due to diseases made worse by the pandemic and by the pandemic itself. So this is an example of journalism that is reacting in spite of the fact that it's being harassed by the police. It's still able to respond by doing and having good quality journalism, showing public transparency. The future is uncertain because there's no rule of law. In Nicaragua, we will have elections on November 7, and there can be no elections under a police state and without freedom of press and freedom of expression, in a situation in which citizens simply do not have the right to get together nor to mobilize. However, here we are, and we continue doing journalism. Thank you, Carlos Fernando. And it's incredible how stubborn you are against censorship. That is a wonderful stubbornness, which is characteristic of the Latin American journalism. I also remember a machine, or rather a mantra that we use for many years, and that is journalism saves. Journalism cooperates through collective learning. With few resources, we are able to go to different sources and use different sources. And with that, I would like to invite Monica to share with us her opinion on this first general question. In your opinion, what is the future of journalism in this region? Please unmute. Your microphone is off. Very well. Now it's on. Yes. You can hear me? We do. I was simply expressing my appreciation for the invitation, and I'd like to greet my colleagues. I'm very happy to see you in a year in which we have all had a certain distance, of course, and to have the space to share our ideas and experiences is encouraging. It's always a pleasure to meeting up with you in different places and to exchange our stories and our ways of solving the problems we face. I think the second question that you have asked is a bit more complicated given the Cuban context, a context that is useful to try to generate strategies that will that could prevent a regime such as the one that exists in Cuba now, and that has been able, journalism and journalism has been able to survive in spite of the restrictions to the freedom of expression, freedom of association, to all the freedoms that we've had attacked in the last few years. So we are, to a certain extent, used to Cuba, because Cuba has been like that for practically all our lives. But this generalization of violence is very dangerous because it still is attacking generations and destroying our country. In general, with regard to your first questions about the future of journalism, I think that that is associated with the second question about censorship mechanisms. I have a list, but I don't want to speak about it extensively. But I would like to say that in general, I believe that journalism has a great capacity of resilience. And the fact that we have been able, given the context, to produce such valuable journalism as we have seen in the last few years, I think that truly reflects our strength, our ability, the intelligence we've been able to develop to carry out investigative journalism in a context where there are no legal guarantees to practice a profession. I'm always surprised by what I find every year at the Gabo Festival and also in the Central American Journalism Forum before, because when you hear about the stories about how work is being produced, you realize that there is an enormous commitment towards the profession. And that gives us hope. It's, of course, very difficult. Life as a journalist is very difficult in our countries. We each face a different reality. But when we see that there are people who work without funding, with children, with babies, under a great amount of pressure, with everything against them, when you see that context, for instance, the one in Cuba, you would think that theoretically, at least, there could be no journalism. It is impossible for journalism to be compatible with the situation. But that context, to still have journalism in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, for instance, for me, that is a sign of hope. Also, in the case of our countries, whether that is good or bad, still being a journalist also means that you have to be a kind of militant, because journalism is punishable in Cuba at any time. There are a number of legal codes within the criminal code that punish you for doing certain things. Some people end up in prison because of that. So when you see people producing journalism in a context such as that, you have greater faith in that journalism. And with that in mind, I would like to say that in the end, you become an activist, because you could be punished, and you end up doing activism in favor of freedom of expression. And there's a duality, because the profession leads you to civil disobedience, which is, since journalism can be punished, and at the end, and penalized at the end, more than doing just a certain job, you end up having to fight for certain freedoms. That involves a number of challenges for practicing journalism, because sometimes you have to face certain specific limits. You have to act as an activist, not only as a journalist. And that is a reality that I believe that many journalists in the region face in a number of countries, and that actually defines our work. So that, as far as that is concerned, I think that, well, I am optimistic with regard to what we're doing. And at the same time, I am cautious, because, well, for instance, right now I'm in Madrid. I'm not in Cuba. I left in January this year. I was working in my company Estornudo until the end of 2019. Now there are no Estornudo journalists in Cuba itself. Almost all people in the media are in a similar situation. There are about 20 journalists from the last 5 years, journalists that I personally know. There are, of course, those that I don't know who have had to leave Cuba for reasons associated to the lack of guarantees to practice journalism. And I do believe that as part of that process, as part of the struggle, there has to be kind of a relay. There's some people who need to leave, then go back, because you're working in not only in investigative journalism, but with people, with emotions, with very delicate situations. And a journalist who carries out activism in favor of freedom of expression and who is resisting a number of pressures by government, by a state, becomes a person who's much more vulnerable in their work and much more likely to suffer a number of problems than journalists who are in normal circumstances. And you can't do your work, you can't focus, you can't keep clarity in your work if you're not emotionally ready for that.
Mismo que hablaba del exilio antes de los medios.
Now, when I talk about being in exile from the media, we're talking about upholding, defending human rights, not just the press, but what that means for human rights. And so this calls for a renewal of the media, of new generations of journalists. And that speaks to the resilience. It also has to do with the life and the mental health of journalists. We have to protect these journalists. This is something we've learned from the context we work in. And as difficult as things can be, this is also an opportunity for us to renew our efforts. And we also have to know how to take care of ourselves. Thank you, Monica. I couldn't agree with you more. Just a week ago, we were speaking with people who work on matters of protection and defense of journalists. It's not just that journalists are under threat from outside forces, but they also have to protect their own emotional and mental well-being. I like your reference to resilience and how hopeful your message is. Thank you for the invitation, for this opportunity to speak. It's an honor to be on this panel with everyone. I am not a journalist, I am a lawyer. Working in the area of freedom of expression and access to information. So yes, I do have a very close connection and relationship with journalism, those who exercise their freedom of expression that I seek as a lawyer to protect. And I'm fully aware of the importance of journalists and their value in any democratic system. Now, what does journalism face? The question that you posed. I think we need to strike a distinction here. We do face a challenge, that's true, but this is also an opportunity of a moment of great opportunities. As Luz Mili was saying, as Monica was saying, unfortunately, there are still threats that persist in our region. As the ambassador was saying earlier, Latin America is known for one of the most violent regions in the world against journalists throughout the world. And the work done by the rapporteurship over the years to shore up efforts made to fight impunity when such crimes are committed, and to wage this fight against violence against journalists. Now, there are concrete challenges and opportunities, but I too want to conclude with a hopeful note. So I think that there is an opportunity. On the one hand, I think we have a problem, and one of sustainability of the press, of media outlets. That's something that Pedro raised and others. And there are a number of issues that come up. We've got the business model aspect and persistent problems, not just the costs of journalism. Well, the costs entailed in investigative journalism, for example, that's always been a challenge in our region to keep up with those expenses. But as Pedro said earlier, the fact that many media outlets are dependent on being the spokespersons for the official news of a given government. That's something that's not new to the region. And that is important when we look at the ecosystem of outlets and their sustainability. Now, the sustainability crisis, there are two things that we need to look at that are very important when we talk about how they interconnect with other challenges that I'm going to address today. One is the fact that work in journalism has become precarious. There's no job security and a lack of specialization in journalism that goes hand in hand with a requirement for them to churn out news ever faster, a very accelerated news cycle that journalists are pressed to keep up with. Now, the sustainability crisis segues into the next challenge that I want to mention, and that is a crisis of trust. Now, we can say that journalism is brilliant and everyone does everything very well, but we do see a crisis here that journalism faces. That's a lack of confidence or trust. Now, it's very rightfully said and shown how essential journalism is to democracy, but it's also equally right to say that journalism faces a trust crisis, sometimes in some countries more than others. But there are three important aspects I would underscore here. The concentration of media, for example, this is a global phenomenon. It's not something that only hurts our region. There is a concentration of media outlets that itself undermines a plurality of expression, and there's much activist journalism tied to partisan interests. We see that from the northernmost region to the southernmost region of our region, to greater or lesser degrees according to the different periods of time. For example, electoral periods, it happens more, there's more polarization, a little bit less once elections have passed. But this is a rising trend that undermines people's trust in the media. Something else that's important, and the fact that journalism can be used to disseminate fake news, misinformation. It can also be a solution to it. But as much as it should be a solution for it, it's also something that spreads it. Oftentimes, this is a result of journalists who don't have much time to check their sources, check the information, and the fact that the news rooms require a constant, again, churning out of news, and time isn't devoted to checking the facts, and clickbait, the fact that they generate news that just is designed to attract clicks, that undermines trust in journalism. Another problem is that vast segments of society get their news from a few platforms. This is very closely tied to the future regulation of the internet. How internet ultimately is regulated, then we can talk about better or worse conditions for journalism to thrive, to flourish. Incentives to monetize, demonetize certain contents. The media is increasingly dependent on the internet and on concrete platforms for the dissemination of information, and that also holds journalists hostage to the terms set by those platforms. Terms and conditions that are set by those platforms can hamstring the journalists. Now, to try to conclude, in a more positive note, we are going through a period in which there is much thirst for serious journalism, independent journalism. Now, given the phenomenon of disinformation, it has become much clearer that there is a need for professional, serious journalists with sources. And as Pedro said a moment ago, current conditions might be the best ever in history. There's a democratization of sources that journalists can draw from at a low cost. They can access these sources. And this has been made possible by technology and many of the debates and discussions that we see. We see this in Australia. I think we find ourselves at a juncture in which we have options. Either we perpetuate models as they've been, we don't change anything, and we try to continue financing what had been financed thus far in a given way, or we look further ahead and we try to come up with a new way of producing journalism, availing ourselves of technological tools that are available to our business more now than ever before. Thank you, Agustina. I agree with you. This is a great time to do journalism and very necessary. Now, a second round of questions. Luz Meli, I would ask you to speak a bit more in depth about censorship. What mechanisms of censorship exist in your view? What more sophisticated types of censorship have you seen? And given this venue that we're speaking at, what do you think the role of the OAS is in a dialogue with leaders in your region on this subject matter? I think we have to view ourselves as a catalyst of solutions. And so when talking about censorship, I think that also has to go hand in hand with the call for any of us who have an influence to work against censorship. Well, thank you. I tend to be mostly optimistic, but I've become much more of a realist nowadays, given the crisis we're going through. But in this conversation, I think there are some elements that we need to raise. And when we speak of the different mechanisms of censorship, I would say that there is a mechanism that is a limitation on access to information, which ultimately is a form of censorship. If we, well, first in most Latin American countries, with few exceptions, we're not producing our own information technology, communication technology. We're using social media, platforms, programs. We're not using, rather, platforms that have been created in our own countries based on our own reality. So we have to address the issue of access to technology and the production of models and the cost of those technologies, because it's only half true to say it costs less to produce journalism, given the use of internet. Everything entails a cost. And this is something that costs the users who seek access to information that perhaps only have one given technological platform, web page, smartphone, which is their channel to access to information. And so we have to be mindful of that to see how we can insert ourselves there and have an influence. Now, in traditional terms, there are regulations and laws. In the case of Venezuela, we just heard from Monica everything that's happening in Cuba. And I think Nicaragua and Venezuela also have the same things happening. You've got a hate law that's enforced. When we say that we have to speak of hate speech, that can be used against someone who's just expressing their viewpoint. That's a simple example. Now, a journalist who speaks of how hard it is to get contraceptives, and that's a topic that cannot be, that the government doesn't allow us to address. That's another type of censorship. Something else that we have to pay a lot of attention to is a law that was passed by the National Assembly of Venezuela, an anti-blocking law. That law hasn't yet been fully enabled, but it's already being enforced. And what that means is there are decisions that are going to be kept secret, given that sanctions can be, well, there have been sanctions brought against Venezuela, so decisions that have to be made that should be in the public domain, we'll never learn about. The public never learns about government decisions because there is this muzzle placed on publication of such news. And then you also have the matter of retaliation being carried out against journalists. Something else that's very effective is the use of journalistic tools to generate misinformation, disinformation, and uncertainty. We see this a lot in Latin America and in other countries as well. Now, from this concept of power, in which you can't buck power, you can't question it. This happens in Turkey and other places, in Venezuela, in which what happens is the messenger is attacked. You might, as a journalist, have taken part in some collective journalistic effort, and you have no control over whether that is published, and then you're going to have those people who don't believe what you're saying. That's a subtle mechanism that has been made, turned into something that's taken as a given, as natural. And well, yes, I continue being someone who follows the codes of ethics in journalism, and I check my sources and so forth. but there might still be people who don't believe the truth, something that has been fact-checked, that has been ascertained, because there is a whole disinformation structure that's been stood up by the government itself. We've seen this in Brazil. It's still happening. We've seen it in Mexico. And we've heard examples of that by the people on the panel. It's a subtle tool. And just to conclude this part, what can be done from the OAS? I think concrete steps have to be taken. Less orthodox ones, to put it that way. When a journalist is attacked or has his or her reputation attacked and does not have any mechanism in that country to effectively defend herself from that allegation, then that journalist is defenseless, helpless. So I would ask whether it would be possible not just to have a discussion, but to actually look into what legal mechanisms could be brought to bear to help journalists who have been smeared to recover their good name. Because I have to think about the implications of the fact that a journalist is targeted by smear and intimidation campaigns, and how that affects how news is spread. Thank you. And I give the floor to Carlos Fernandez. Censorship has always been a fact of life in Nicaragua. Last year, 4 laws were enacted. They're not sophisticated at all, but what they seek to do is to legalize the application or the use of force. Censorship in television, the program that I direct on TV, that type of censorship isn't based on any law. It's just something that's done. Either we broadcast what they want us to broadcast, or they're going to shut us down. The spokesperson, Rosario Murillo, the vice president of the country, and the paramilitary groups also issue threats. A paramilitary fanatic killed a journalist, and when that murder was tried, the defense held up as an extenuating circumstance the fact that suspect or defendant was affected by the climate protest that was taking place in the country. Laws passed last year, cybercrime law provides, and the presumed crime of spreading false news. Anyone that is found to spread false news that could cause moral harm or unrest in society can be incarcerated from 2 to 4 years. Now, who's going to determine what fake news is? A judge? There is no autonomous, independent, impartial judge in Nicaragua. They are the henchmen of the regime. And that law is not only directed against, aimed at journalists, but explicitly against citizens, social networks and their use, and civil servants who are a necessary source of information despite censorship. They are a source of information for independent journalism. We wouldn't have access to public information any other way, but thank goodness there are civil servants who do provide us with information. You've got the foreign agent regulation law. This is something we've seen in Venezuela and Cuba as well, that seeks to, that affects the political rights of citizens, any group that receives any type of foreign aid has to report that, and if not, that person or body organization loses their political rights. The sound, says the interpreter, has become impossible to interpret. We're having audio problems. We can't hear you, Mr. Chamorro. I apologize. Now it seems to have gotten better. The third law, which for hate crimes, alleged hate crimes, carries up to a life sentence. The president wanted this law to be passed. He was pushing for it. And so any type of civic demonstration, protest, can be viewed as an attempted coup and bring with it a life sentence. You've got the National Sovereignty Defense Law, which deems as someone who is betraying, a traitor, betraying the country, anyone who says anything against the regime. Anyone who seeks for there to be international pressure brought to isolate the regime would be viewed in violation of this national sovereignty law. And any media outlets can be shut down under this law. Look at the OAS. What can the OAS do? It's a host of countries, and it has obligation of upholding the democratic charter. And if we look at this crisis in Nicaragua, you've got the democratic charter that's being trampled on, violated, has been for the last 3 years by the regime. And then, on the other hand, there are state commitments to hold elections in Nicaragua, but until now, those elections don't enjoy the minimal requirements for freedom of express, freedom of movement, international observation, to ensure that those elections are carried out properly. This is a political problem that goes much beyond the specific problem of censorship of the media. We can't separate censorship from other democratic rights that are being trampled on in our country. Thank you, Carlos. Monica has the floor to answer this second question. After having heard your long list of different types of censorship, I would like to clarify that violence against journalists in Cuba is quite sophisticated. All violence against journalists seeks to silence them through death or other mechanisms. Now, death is something that gets a lot of press coverage and has a huge impact because there's nothing more important than one's life. But in Cuba, there has been a system of repression against freedom of expression and journalism that has been instituted, that's carried out against activists and professionals, that also has a chilling effect, that silences society. And that's the only thing that's made it possible for Cuba throughout its history to operate under the same single party, the same government. In 2021, we see that some of the measures in place years ago, the 2003 Black Spring episode, in which a number of independent journalists were incarcerated and given 20-year prison sentences. There was an activist And in that case, the prosecutor was looking for the death penalty against that journalist, because journalists are oftentimes viewed as mercenaries working for foreign interests. So penalties are very severe just for doing our job. Now, that was 2003. We haven't seen that. Well, there was a process in 2011 whereby this issue was mediated with the help of Spain, and most of those journalists who were caught up in that dragnet in 2003 were able to leave the country and are living in exile. Now, there was a change in government. Raúl came in to office. There was opening up to the private sector of the economy. 2009, 2010, that's when we saw that reform. And relations thawed with the U.S. In 2013, we had greater access to the internet, mobile data. This new generation of journalists, after that crackdown in 2003, are facing a more subtle type of repression. Now, if you're, for example, reporting on arbitrary detentions, that journalist can be whisked away off the street, disappears for a couple hours, no one knows where that journalist is, and then all of a sudden, after hours or days, a person reappears. That's one of the mechanisms of repression being used by the state authority to wear down people, be they activists, journalists, anyone fighting for freedom of expression.
Más o menos,
Interrogations are more or less the same, where in police stations or in other places, people are there for hours and no one knows what happened to you while you're being interrogated. In November, as a matter of fact, Carlos Manuel Alvarez was in Cuba to cover everything that happened with the San Isidro movement, which is another long story. And one of the interrogations where he was interrogated, suddenly, after a few hours, a state security agent, because he had been staying at home, told me, give me his belongings because we are going to try him and we're going to take him somewhere else. So these are things that are not clear, that are not transparent, especially during these interrogations where you don't know where the person is, you don't know what's going to happen to that person, what the results will be. That is terrible. For instance, in the interrogation I was subjected to in April, I ended up being fined by on the basis of the 330 decree, although lately that has not been applied, but it has been used to censor certain publications, especially internet publications. Well, I was given a fine of $20 because of a post in which I shared information about my work, my opinion on certain news. I don't even share memes in Facebook, maybe once in a while, but I really don't operate aggressively in Facebook compared to some people who are much more activist than I am, who are much more head-on and criticize people face-on. But still, they felt that my post, and they had this amount of information with my publications, they decided that I was attacking the integrity of the state, and therefore I was fined. Officials from the Ministry of Communications, because in the final analysis, all institutions in Cuba, even though supposedly there is a difference in the different branches, they all end up reporting to the same party, to the same group. So agents from state security at a police station were there with officials from the Ministry of Communications. So where respect of basic rights should be respected, even though that is something that should be respected, still all of these violations of human rights have an impact on us. As an independent journalist, for instance, I wouldn't have any entity to go to defend my rights vis-a-vis the state, because when state security becomes a point of attack, then we have no other entity to go to, because all the courts, the district attorney's office, they're all under that same branch. So arbitrary detentions, interrogations, which are a kind of detention because it's compulsory, there they also take away your equipment, they confiscate your equipment, they can even destroy your equipment. So now there, what we have, the acts of repudiation, that is something that has come up again, where people go to your home with all these kind of signs saying, hey, leave because you are a terrible person. For instance, one journalist who is a mother of 3 children who had a wall in her house that said Patria o Dictadura. Well, the people came to her home, including teachers of their children. Can you imagine how traumatic for her children? They were going to a school, which was, of course, state school. Can you imagine for these children going to school where there was a teacher who ended up attacking their home? So these people began repainting this person's walls. This is the new way in which people are attacking us, which used to be the case in the 80s but had kind of stopped, is what we call acts of repudiation. And this leads very often to, incentivates violence, and it leads to conflicts among citizens, because people who participate, they're very often coerced to participate in these actions. Then we have the social networks, where continuously information, intimate information, private information is being revealed, which puts their private life in danger. For instance, nude photos, communications with your partner, that is anything that can assassinate the person's reputation. They also block the media, independent media. Many of them, for instance, the Foundation Gabo, we cannot access its web page. There are a number of web pages we cannot access, websites we cannot access from Cuba. There are also regulations. Until March 2020, there had been over 245 people who had been regulated due to political reasons. They could not leave the country. They were at risk, where they wanted to maybe leave the country even for a short time, but the authorities did not allow them to leave. So they find about it very often when they get to the airport. Suddenly they're at the airport and they are told suddenly that they cannot leave. And this regulation, which is anti-constitutional and illegal, we have not been able to eliminate it. So in Cuba, you don't have to kill a journalist. You simply can ban him or her to practice freedom of expression. And you're creating a number of mechanisms of pressure and censorship aimed at silencing that person, and they are very effective. They also threaten your family. They go visit neighbors. Some people, their parents have lost their jobs because most of the jobs in Cuba are part of the state. For instance, a doctor in Cuba can only practice his or her profession with the state. The same with teachers. Teachers have been expelled from universities, for instance. That has been a mechanism of repression and pressure, because When you expel that teacher from the university or from a high school, they end up without a career, or scientists too, because all scientific entities belong to the state. So it is a system in which your whole life, everything, your whole life, without any exceptions, your whole life is controlled by state security. There's no law of transparency, nothing. As a matter of fact, I identified with what was being said about the law against embargo, because when that was mentioned by Luz Meli. Since we're a country under embargo, we have to adopt a number of strategies to avoid that embargo, and there's a lot of information that is relevant for the society that cannot be revealed because Cuba needs to protect itself to avoid the embargo. So it's a kind of an umbrella that covers everything, simply everything. Well, basically, that is our context from laws. As a matter of fact, they just published a list of activities that are prohibited under self-employment. Anything having to do with journalism is covered there in that list. A whole lot of things are prohibited in the country in that area. So these things seem to be small because you say, well, okay, they threatened my family. Well, they published a few of my nude photos in Facebook. Okay. They have threatened my parents and so on. Well, they arrested me. Well, they made me leave. Well, so it goes up and up. These things may be minor little by little, but and separately, but when you bring them together, when you are a person exposed to all of that at the same time, it is terrible. You destroy that person. You didn't kill that person, but you silenced him or her. And you managed to do that slowly so as not to draw the attention of the international community. This is, well, a journalist has been arrested for a few hours in Cuba. That's not news anymore. So nothing is news anymore, and the state has still managed to silence everyone. And that's what I think is extremely important to consider and to bear in mind throughout the region, because it's a system. It's happened in Cuba, and it's happening in other places because it's effective. It works. And they've kept at it for 62 years in my country. And some people say that Cuba is a paradigm of freedom and an example of freedom and no violation of human rights. But it's incredible that in 2021 we still see that. And as for communications, it's just one company that manages all communications domestically and has managed to filter the whole database of the users. Right now, my data, my address, my telephone, all of that is public in Cuba. If I have a problem, animal activists in Cuba, for instance, who are trying to eliminate cockfights, for instance, they are really under threat because their information is being published in Cuba. So they're within a system that is so perfect that it should be studied by us, because if we feel that it can only happen in Cuba, we are wrong. I think that we have to be bear in mind how these mechanisms work, because they go slowly, little by little, and suddenly they have destroyed the country altogether. Thank you, Monica. It really shows the terrible gap and cliff that the different countries in the region face. I would like to avail myself of this opportunity to echo what Carlos Fernando was saying, and that is that the OAS is a forum to cover these challenges, also aimed at protecting democracy and human rights. I'll change now a bit the flow of things because of time, so I would like to ask Agustina to reply to the second and third question, but speak also about content and internet. What you see, how you see it, who puts it there, who posts it there. Well, welcome. Agustina? Thank you, Pedro. Regarding censorship mechanisms, I think that everybody who has spoken has have said better than I have what I can say about censorship mechanisms. I would add 3 or 4 things to complement this. First of all, I think the traditional censorship mechanisms that many of you described are aggravated today because of the mass surveillance that states have the ability to do that before they did not. There were maybe 3 or 4 scandals in the region of states who use software to follow certain journalists, their accounts, etc. I think that is a major risk and a new facet of censorship in the region. Very connected to this, there is a practice in Argentina that is called cyber patrol. It's simply intelligence in open source which follows up accounts of certain people in the internet. And in some countries of the region, this has been accompanied by penalizing freedom of expression and criminalizing freedom of expression, where there certain crimes or certain things are considered to be crimes now. For instance, to share supposedly fake news or disinformation. There were accusations of that type, and certain criminal codes that previously had not been used are now being used against these type of alleged crimes. They criminalized the situation of journalists who were disseminating information that they felt was contrary to what the government was saying about the number of people who had died, for instance, of COVID, the number of people in hospitals, etc. And speaking of that, I would like to go to your next question, to your second question, and that is that one of the greatest risks that we face today is that there's the flowering of legislation which seems to be new, but is not really new. I believe that we are seeing that new draft bills are arising in the region. For instance, in Argentina, we have an observatory on freedom of expression that shows how internet regulation has an impact on certain freedom of expression standards that we have in the region. So debates that had been closed have opened up again. Now we have opened a debate again on libel and slander, discriminatory speech. That debate, that discussion has reopened, has reemerged because of internet. So there's a risk, a major risk there of having to renegotiate the legitimate limits of freedom of expression, something that was so difficult for us to achieve in our region. It was a difficult task by journalists, by defenders of human rights, by the media. And I think that risk still exists because of that legislation. For instance, the one in Nicaragua, in Ecuador now too, the one in Venezuela. I think that these are examples of these type of practices. As for content moderation, I think that there are new types of censorship now. I don't like to necessarily make reference to private censorship. I think that there's certain limitations in speech in internet, certain platforms. To speak about private censorship is to oversimplify to a certain extent the problem of content moderation. I believe that yes, there has to be a role to be played by the state in this discussion. There has to be a democratic debate on these questions, on these subjects. And a second point is that I think that it is wrong to think that there are no laws to be applied to internet and content moderation. I think that to the extent that our human rights are the same, both online and offline, there is a legislation that applies and that should and could be used more. And I'd like to say that there's very little prosecution of arbitrary downloads in our region. What I mean is that there's little done judicially and few appeals too. I don't know if that is because people don't know about appeal mechanisms or if the access to justice is too complex for some. That is a subject that the state has the power and the obligation to cover and to consider. When thinking about content moderation, I think that there is a pending debate on the levels of transparency that we wish to have and the limits that self-regulation must have. Other than that, I don't think it's a good idea for the state to regulate terms and conditions of the companies. That's something that the companies have to work on. That has to do also, and that shows a richness in the ecosystems. We have various platforms with different purposes. Today, as a matter of fact, we were speaking about Twitter and Facebook rules, one versus the other. These are two different universes, two different targets to a certain extent. They don't have the same objectives, and the limitations regarding their content maybe should be different. And with this, I conclude. I would like to say that I believe the answer is yes. States have an interest in ensuring human rights in internet, and that includes to surveil or oversee these type of companies. I do think that it has to be clear why, what for. That has to be clear, and especially not try to frame, or rather, we should frame the discussion in clear terms so that state regulation does not become co-opting or micromanagement, as English speakers say. So, well, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you so very much. Thank you very much, Agustina. As a matter of fact, we have very little time left, so I wanted to see if anybody wants to speak about a specific case for a minute, and then give the floor to Maria Celina, who will make a few final comments. Any specific case that any of you wish to share with us, given that we really don't have much time left? And assuming that this conversation will also continue. Luz Meli and then Carlos Fernando. I simply wanted to say that I fully support what Agustina said, but I do want to remind you of the importance of literacy, especially when you said that there are little judicial process for appeals due to downloading of content. In Venezuela, this has become something very common, that they're used, that corrupt people or people involved in certain investigations, they petition servers to download or criminalize certain content by alleging copyright or the right to the good name. So the regulator or the server downloads the content, and that content then disappears. And that's one of the tactics that are being used now. Thank you, Luz Meli. Carlos Fernando. Very briefly, first, thank you for convening this forum, and I would like to thank you for inviting Luz Meli, Monica, and me. because when I hear them, I see where we're going with our dictatorship in Nicaragua, and the efecto cocuyo journalism that I see is interesting. I find interesting what they've spoken about. The dictatorships in our three countries are not regulating censorship. They simply persecute and control, and that's what they do through their laws. And the last thing is that the noise that Pedro spoke about at the beginning is incredible, but social networks and internet are also an enormous opportunity to defeat censorship. Without access to YouTube, I could not disseminate content that has been censored. It's true, they're not a space for public debate, social networks, I mean, but good quality journalism can establish its standards and can establish its relationship with the audience. Fighting ardently against that noise and that major tide in which we find ourselves, where we're trying to fight for freedom. I don't know if Monica wanted to make a final specific comment. If not, we will go to Maria Celina. Thank you very much. Well, actually, you already made all the necessary observations that I think had to be made. I simply wanted to thank you all for your participation, for this very enriching and frank discussion and conversation. I would like to thank you on behalf of the Summit Secretariats and the Secretary General of the OAS for this. This is an important space. I would also like to especially thank Pedro Vaca, for the commitment he has shown and for his willingness to offer this space, this joint space, and especially to each one of the panelists, because in a very open way, they have shared their analyses and reflections. And through you, I would like to emphasize the courage and commitment that you have shown and that journalists show by practicing their profession. I will not repeat what has already been stated so well. You will have an audio and video record of this meeting and of the report, but I would like to underline a couple of subjects. First, that press, as we have seen, finds itself in a permanent act of resistance and resilience, given intimidation acts, mechanisms of aggression are also reported. Also, when certain actions of practicing journalism become targets of criminal actions, slander, persecution, so journalist opacity. So all of these things are occurring in different contexts. We've heard about threats to journalists who are in exile themselves. I would also like to say that in addition to the issues that we've heard about here and the challenges that we have seen throughout the last few years, reflected in your words, and that are common in a number of countries in the world too, including in this region, and that have increased in light of the present context, the context of the pandemic, a difficult context in which a number of pressures have increased. We also have major challenges that are faced and by the digital world. That is something we could maybe speak about in another discussion, but we are now initially only preparing the next Summit of the Americas. We're working on that. So this kind of conversation at this point in time with RELE, with a special rapporteur on freedom of expression is something very relevant. It allows us to reach the different stakeholders. As a matter of fact, protection of the job of journalism and of people who investigate corruption from the point of view of human rights has received special attention at the 8th Summit of the Americas. This is a subject that can be seen throughout this whole process, but it was especially emphasized then, and we hope that it will continue being so. And I would like to remind you that the Inter-American Democratic Charter was also the result of one of the summits, of the 3rd summit. This year is the 20th anniversary, as you know, of the summit. So we hope to be able to continue holding meetings such as this one that can contribute to the next summit of the Americas. We hope that attention to these subjects will continue being stressed within the framework of the summit process, so that there will be more options to revert to a certain extent the difficulties and challenges that are being faced now by the freedom of expression and journalism and journalists, independent journalists in the Americas. As Albert Campos was saying, as you well know, a French journalist who won the Nobel Prize of Literature over 60 years ago, which is still in effect. A free press can be good press or bad press, but without freedom of the press, it will only be bad. So thank you very much to all of you, and I hope that this is not only the first and only time to see you within the Secretariat, the Summit Secretariat process. We also like to thank the public and the Technical Secretariat of the Summit process. We are at your service. Thank you so very much.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Que tengan muy buen día. Muchas gracias por participar.
Gracias. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Gracias.